Right, okay, and that's fine. Okay, so over to you, Rabbi Davis. Welcome to Rabbi Davis joining us today from Chigwell. Your second appearance with us, so obviously you did a good job last time. And over to you for some words of Torah.
Stephen, thank you very much. Just before I commence, can you please enable me to screen share?
I can certainly do that. 1 second. There we go. You should be able to share the screen now.
Okay, very good. Okay, so there we are. Just trying to pin myself. And very good. So, good morning, everyone. Parshas Pinchas. So, before we go into the main part of the shir, just by way of introduction, it seems to be a bunch of disconnected things. The main part of the early part of the Sedra, after we deal with Pinchas ben Aaron, ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen. So we know how last week's Sedra ended, and Hashem in the beginning. This week's Parsha gives him the Brit Shalom. But okay, so there's that. Then there's the big census that takes place. What has that got to do with Pinchas? And after that, we have the daughters of Tzlofchad approaching Moshe for a share in the land. What's the connection there? And then God tells Moshe that his life is coming to an end and he has to go up the mountain, he's going to die there. And it becomes a discussion about who's going to succeed him. And then finally, we have Chamishi, Shishi, Shvi, all about the Korbanot, all about the sacrifices, the daily, the weekly, the monthly, Rosh Chodesh, and of course, all the festivals. How does the Seder as a whole hang together? And you'll see that I've called the title of today's talk, Love of the Land, because I do believe that that is how it all hangs together. It is, of course, about succession. Pinchas, after all, is the son of Elazar, who's the son of Aaron. Yoshua is going to succeed Moshe. Even the daughters of Tzlofchad, will come to them in a moment, are succeeding their father. Very much is about a generational change. But more than that, it's about possession of the land. Because we find the role of the Kohanim, the Leviim, also alluded to in the parasha. The census, why is it conducted? Well, the Midrash brings several reasons, but the straightforward pshat, the straightforward understanding from the text is very simple. It says, La'ele techalek haaretz. For these, those in the census, you will allocate the land. So it's about dividing up the land. That is why the census is taken at this point, just prior to their entry to the land of Israel. And it's therefore not surprising that at that point, the daughters of Tzlofchad come forward with their claim to their father's portion, as we'll see in a moment. And once they are claiming their portion, Medrash says, well, Moshe puts in a claim for his. Maybe his sons will succeed him. It doesn't say so in the text, but there's possible allusion to it. Be that as it may, who is going to succeed Moshe? It's going to be Joshua, who is also very much connected to the land. He is one of the 2 spies that were sent by Moshe who came back with a good report. And what about all the sacrifices at the end? If you want to keep the land, you have to have actions that connect you with Hashem on a daily basis. That is what the daily sacrifice represents. The Shabbat sacrifice is we up our game once a week, Shabbat. And then the festivals dotted around the year, all with their special meaning. You want to keep the land, you keep that connection to Hashem. So I think actually they do all hang together, all these different bits. But let's take a look at the following. So we find Eile Pekudei Moshe. So at the end of the census, this was the census that Moshe and Elazar, the Kohen, took of the Bnei Israel, took of the Israelites of the plains of Moab, the Jordan near Jericho. Uve'ele lo haya ish, etc. Among these, there was not a single man, and I've deliberately translated ish as man and not as person, because that's what it means here. There was not a single man amongst the census taken by Moses and Aaron, the priest, or the Israelites in the Sinai desert. You had the census in Parshat Bamidbar, you got the census in Parshat Pinchas, and there are no names on both, with two exceptions. But just to remind ourselves, Ki amar Hashem lahem mot yamutu bamidbar, because God had said of them, they shall surely die in the desert, v'lo notar mehem ish, not a man survived. Ki im Kaleb ben Yefuneh v'Yoshua ben Nun. Just these two. Why were they the exceptions? As we already alluded to. They were the two spies who came back with a good report. Tragically, no one believed them. They went with the majority, and the result was 40 years in the desert, and now they are approaching the land for a second time with a new census. And this is clearly dedicated to the division of the land. Rashi comments on this, lo notar mehem ish, or ve'ele lo haya ish. There's no man. And what does Rashi say? Ve'ele lo haya ish. The women didn't suffer the decree of the spies because they loved the land. The men said, let's appoint a new leader and return to Egypt. And the women said, give us a portion of land. And this is why, says Rashi, the portion of Tzlov then follows. It's interesting, I was struck that from time to time I mention the story of the daughters of Tzlov and people don't know what we're talking about. So let's have a look at this story. ותקרבנה בנות צלופחד בן יחזקאל בגלה בן מנשה למשפחות מנשה בן יוסף. You'll see I've underlined certain bits. But we have the daughters of Tzlopchad, the son of Chefer, the son of Gilad, the son of Machir, who is the son of Menashe, who is the son of Yosef, came forward. And their names, Machla, Noach, Hogla, Milcah, Tirzah. Question I want to ask is, where have we heard of Machir before? So the Chochem will say, well, a bit earlier in Pinchas, there's a census. All the heads of the tribes are mentioned, and Machir is one of them. Where have we heard of Machir before that? We'll come back to that. And we find these 5 daughters of Tzlopchad stood before Moshe, Elazar the priest, the princes, and the entire assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they said as follows: our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of Korach's group who protested against God, but he died for his own sin, leaving no sons. And they said, Lama yigara Shem Avinu mitop mishpachto. Why should our father's name be disadvantaged in his family just because he had no son? Give us a holding amongst our father's kinsmen. Now, just point out here that there's a very strong connection between a family and the land. It wasn't just, okay, Israel's the country they're living in. No, it's much stronger than that. Each family had this connection with the land. Second thing to point out is he died of his own sin. One could say, well, so what? All right, they weren't part of Korach's sin, but presumably he did his own thing. Now the Midrash says he was the one in Parshat Shalach Lecha, recorded. Now, Parshat Shalach Lecha contains the sin of the spies. And towards the end of the parasha, we find that a man goes out on Shabbat gathering sticks and he's put to death. We're not told his name. Midrash says that was Tzlofchad. So that was also regarded as pretty bad. Why should he get let off the hook in terms of an allocation of land, whereas the spies did not, or Korach's group did not? And the answer, the brief answer is that he did his own sin, but he didn't involve other people. Korach was a real rabble rouser and wanted to bring the whole house down. Very big difference. So, back to the claim. Why should our father's name be disadvantaged? We want to have the land. Okay, where have we heard of Machir before? So, right here, Bereshit, the very end of Bereshit, we know the story of Joseph and his brothers. He was sold into slavery by the brothers. He became the viceroy of Egypt. They came to Egypt at the time of famine. And to make a long story short, they reconciled. And they remained reconciled long after the death of their father, Jacob. Now, there's a very poignant piece right at the end of Bereshit. And it's this. Vayar Yosef le'Ephraim b'nei Shileshim, gam b'nei Machir ben Menashe yuldu b'kei Yosef. Joseph lived to see the children of the third generation of Ephraim, and the children of Machir, the son of Moshe, were also raised upon Joseph's knees. Joseph saw great-grandchildren. This Joseph, who might have died in the pit, got to see great-grandchildren. And Machir is specifically mentioned here. That's where we've seen Machir before. Joseph raised them on his knees. What do you think he said to them? Was it just nursery rhymes? I think we have a clue in the next verse. So after a while, no one lives forever. And Yosef said to the brothers as follows. Joseph said to the brothers, I'm about to die. And God will grant you special providence. This is such a powerful expression, by the way, just to sidetrack for a moment. He said these words, pakod yifkod. It's a magic formula. The next time we encounter this, apart from the next verse, is going to be Moshe hearing God use this expression at the burning bush. And this has been passed down during the years of Egyptian slavery from parents to children. Pakod yifkod. One day, God is going to come and give us special providence. And God says to Moses at the burning bush, Pakod pakadati. This is it. And we're reminded of this again in Beshalach when they actually do leave Egypt. Be that as it may, what is that special providence? Yosef tells his brothers, Vehela etchem min haaretz hazot. He will bring you up from this land, El haaretz asher nishbal Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, to the land that he promised to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's powerful stuff. Do you want to know what Yosef said to his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren? This is what he said, the connection to the land. And just to finish off that particular section, Vayashba Yosef b'nei Israel lemor, Yosef made b'nei Israel promise, Pakod yivkod Elohim etchem, when God has given you special providence, taken notice of you, you'll carry up my bones from here. Don't leave me behind when you leave this country. And we find in Pasha B'Shalach, Moshe himself undertook responsibility for this mission, and Yosef was buried in Shechem. Be that as it may, we now find years later, offspring, 5 sisters, offspring of Machir. Let's just go back to that verse, the previous verse, the quote from this week's Sedra. It's very unusual that it would be taken, the genealogy, all the way back, Ben Machir, Ben Menashe. Okay, this is the Sedra of the census. You understand it's going back to Menashe. But why all the way to the families of Menashe ben Yosef, Menashe, the son of Joseph? Because it was Joseph's inspiration that trickled down all the way to Tzlofchad. Now, I want to introduce a commentator that I must say I hadn't heard of him till this week, Rabbi Asher Versatile. Lived in 1921 to 2008. He was born in Poland, raised though in Germany. Parents moved at a young age to Germany, and he was put into a school in Germany, the Gymnasia, in 1931, I think it was. But in 1935, as the only Jew in his class, he was thrown out. And from 1935 to 1938, he was educated in the Hildesheim seminary and received a very strong Torah education. And in Elul, just before the war broke out, he received permission to go to Palestine. By the way, he was also imprisoned in Dachau following Kristallnacht. So he saw things pretty close up, pretty awful stuff. And he went to Haifa, and there he learned in yeshiva for a while. And then after the war, he helped with the bringing in the new immigrants to evade the British and so on. But once the state was declared, he devoted the rest of his life to Jewish education and wrote a really interesting commentary called Birkat Asher. So that's by way of introduction. Let's go back, first of all, to Rashi. Rashi on Benot Tzlofchad says as follows, on the words of Mishbechot Menashe ben Yosef, just as Joseph held the promised land dear, and it is said, you shall carry my bones up from here, the quote we just saw, so too his daughters held the land dear, and it is said, give us an inheritance. So this is the comment of Birkat Asher, Rav Asher. He says like this, presumably love of the land is taught in the home, as we see with Joseph. Why did not the other brothers seem to have the same love for the land? He says something remarkable. Joseph and Osnat knew that if they didn't teach a love of the land in their home in Egypt, it wouldn't happen. The other brothers assumed that growing up in the land, it wasn't necessary to educate love of the land. This is not so. Remarkable words. I actually did live in Israel for a number of years prior to entering the rabbinate. And I remember a friend of mine who made Aliyah also from London said to me, well, all our lives we dreamt of this. Now we're here. Now what? I said, what do you mean? He said, how do we continue to inspire our children that what we've done is something incredible and worthwhile and idealistic and all the rest of it? Joseph, living outside the land, understood that. The brothers are living in the land, less so. But of course, we know from today's reality that we have to keep up that inspiration, whether we are in the land or out of the land. So much for Yosef, and Rashi brings this very strong point of the daughters of Tzlopchad continuing the tradition of their father. We have a question. Going back to the Rashi we saw earlier, how can Rashi and the Midrash compare the incidents of the spies and the daughters of Tzlopchad? They were many years apart. The spies came back with a bad report. The whole nation was punished because they believed the spies. The daughters of Tzlopchad have seen all of that. You could say they've learned their lesson. How could you compare the two? The first answer I'd like to suggest is the text itself encourages the comparison, because we'll recall that the text said, Uve'ele lo haya ish, in the census, there was not a single man amongst the census. Why not? Sin of the spies. Very next portion, daughters of Tzlopchad. The text itself invites a comparison. The second thing, the Netziv points out in Amek Davar, they clearly wanted a portion within the land, and he demonstrates how that is so. The Birkat Hasher that we mentioned on the previous slide suggests, based on Yalkut Shimoni, Midrash Yalkut Shimoni, that actually the people rejected the land twice. Once specifically, sin of the spies, they said, let's appoint a new head and return to Egypt. The second time, following the death of Aaron, we read a passage where the people got very fed up on the journey. Why did you take us out of Egypt? And the Midrash there says they actually reversed the journey at several stages, 7 stages to be precise. And there was a mood, we should go back. And it was at that point that the daughters of Tzlopchad spoke up. And therefore there's a contrast between the group rejecting the land and the daughters of Tzlopchad. Okay, just to conclude briefly on that point, that generally the Midrashim, the commentators say that the women in the desert had far more emunah, far more faith than the men. And they point to a number of incidents, but this is really highlighted by Benot Tzlopchad. They wanted a portion in the land, as opposed to that part of the tribe of Manasseh that settled east of the Jordan with Gad and Reuven. I want to briefly touch on Joshua. So we know that God said to Moses, single out Joshua, son of Nun, a man with spirit, ish asher ruach bo, v'samachta yadcha alav, lay your hand upon him. Now, Rashi says, man who there's spirit. What that means is, as you requested, Moshe, someone who's able to deal with the character of each person. But the Netziv takes a different interpretation. A man in whom there is spirit, that is, he's independent in his views. He's not drawn after urges, not for his own pleasure and not for the pleasure of others. This is a man who stood against the majority when they went to look at the land of Israel. And so, in summary, we can say, Joseph bequeathed the love of the land to the offspring of Ephraim and Manasseh. And by the way, well, we'll come to it in a moment. In Pinchas, we see the census is in preparation of the allocation of the land to the tribes, as we mentioned. But not Tzlopchad, the daughters of Tzlopchad demonstrate their love of the land. They are from Manasseh. Yoshua, one of the 2 spies, demonstrates love of the land, is made leader. And Yoshua is from Ephraim. So that verse back in Bereshit sees its fulfillment here in Pinchas. I'm stopping a couple of minutes early just in case there are any questions. Stephen, I don't know how you want to monitor this. You're muted, Stephen. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm just fascinated to note that one of the daughters of Telophatis, her name is Noah. Is that any meaning? Noah's a man's name.
Okay, so Noah is actually also used in modern Israel quite a lot. It's not the same as Noah, the man of the flood. It's with an ayin rather than the chet, and it actually means one who moves around a lot. The word na is to move.
Yeah, I didn't realize it's an ayin.
Yeah.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Okay, I take it there are no other questions.
I've got a question. Can you clarify? I'm getting a little confused in my old age. There were two. There was Kolev and Pinchas and Yehoshua. That makes three, unless two are of the same person. Can you clarify?
Okay, yes. So the two spies that came back, gave Moshe a good report, were Caleb and Yehoshua. Pinchas was the third person. Pinchas undertook the extreme action at the end of last week's Sedra, and for that he's accorded the covenant of everlasting peace. But he's not leadership material in the same way Yehoshua was. Why was Yehoshua chosen? Fundamentally, I mentioned the connection to the land and standing up to the other spies. Of course, that's not the bigger reason. The bigger reason is given in Ki Tisa, Lo Yamish Mitocha Ohel. Yehoshua never left Moshe's side. He was a loyal servant, which meant he really, for 40 years, he absorbed what leadership is.
Why does the Pasuk say there was no man, and then gives exceptions for just two individuals, not three?
Okay, okay, because Pinchas, at the time of the sin of the spies, I am guessing, was not yet a man.
Grown up.
He wasn't yet grown up. So he wasn't culpable for the sin of the spies in the way that anyone over 20 was. Caleb and Yehoshua were the only two that remained. But thank you for asking that, because I'm not sure that I emphasized properly. There was no man, but there were women, because the women had faith. They weren't punished in the way that men were punished.
Thank you. Claire.
Yeah.
Good. You're muted, Stephen.
Stephen, you're muted.
Stephen, you're muted.
Stephen, you're muted.
I'm muted. Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. So, again, sorry. Thank you very much, Rabbi Davis. Sorry, I'm speaking to myself here. Thank you very much, Rabbi Davis, for your interesting talk this morning. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good week. And as I said, the recording will be on the Shaw YouTube site to watch if you want to see it again. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks again, Rabbi Davis. Have a good week, everyone. Bye.
Welcome.
Bye.
Have a good day.